At the holiday party, I smiled and said, "Can't wait for the family reunion tomorrow." My sister snorted. "What? That was last weekend." My aunt pulled out her phone, photo after photo of everyone smiling, without me. My dad just said, "We didn't think you'd want to come." I nodded, unzipped my bag, and pulled out labeled gifts, over $7,200 in luxury items. I let them hold each one, then quietly took them back. "You're right," I said. "I don't belong here." I left and took more than just the presents with me. I, 31M, smiled and nodded at the holiday party, but what happened next changed everything between my family and me forever. The living room buzzed with conversation and laughter, the kind of forced cheer that happens when family gathers for obligation rather than joy. I stood near the fireplace, nursing my third beer and watching my relatives swap stories about work, kids, and weekend plans. The familiar ache of being the outsider settled in my chest, but I'd grown used to it over the years. My sister appeared beside me, her face flushed from wine and whatever gossip she'd been consuming in the kitchen. She wore that smug expression I'd known since childhood, the one that said she knew something I didn't. "Can't wait for the family reunion tomorrow," I said, raising my bottle in a mock toast. She snorted, nearly spilling her drink. "What? That was last weekend." The words hit me like ice water. I stared at her, waiting for the punchline, but her expression remained genuinely confused. "Last weekend," I repeated, my voice barely steady. Before she could answer, our aunt materialized from the crowd, phone already in her hand with that eager look people get when they're about to share photos. She swiped through image after image. The whole family gathered around a massive dining table, kids playing in a backyard I didn't recognize, group shots with everyone's arms wrapped around each other. Faces I'd grown up with, all smiling, all together. Without me. The party noise faded to background static as I processed what I was seeing. 23 people. 3 generations. Even my cousin who lived in Alaska had made it. But somehow, in all the planning and coordination, no one had thought to include me. Dad appeared at my shoulder, probably drawn by my silence. He glanced at the phone, then at my face, and I watched him realize what had happened. "We didn't think you'd want to come," he said simply, as if that explained everything. As if 29 years of family history could be summed up in one assumption. I nodded slowly, setting down my beer. The rational part of my brain understood their logic. I was the one who'd moved across state lines for work. I was the one who'd stopped coming to every birthday and graduation. I was the one who'd built a life that didn't revolve around weekend barbecues and family game nights. But understanding didn't make it hurt less. "You're right," I said, surprised by how calm my voice sounded. "Give me just a second." I walked out to my car, leaving them clustered around the phone. The December air bit at my face, but I welcomed the shock of cold. It cleared my head as I popped the trunk and pulled out the bag I'd spent 3 weeks preparing. The gifts had cost me more than my rent. $7,200 in carefully selected luxury items, each one chosen specifically for the person whose name was written on the elegant tags. A vintage watch for Dad that I'd found after visiting 6 different shops. Imported skincare products for Mom from a boutique that required appointments. Designer handbags, artisanal chocolates, handcrafted jewelry, the kind of thoughtful, expensive presents that said I'd been thinking about them, planning for months. I'd spend hours in stores, asking salespeople for advice, second-guessing every choice. I wanted to show up with something that would prove I belonged, that I was worth including, that I thought of them as much as they apparently didn't think of me. When I returned to the living room, conversation stopped. 20 pairs of eyes tracked my movement as I set the bag on the coffee table and began pulling out packages. "Since we're all together," I announced, "figured this was as good a time as any for Christmas gifts." I handed each one personally, watching faces light up as they felt the weight of quality, saw the expensive wrapping, read the thoughtful cards I'd written. My nephew's eyes went wide at the gaming setup I'd researched for weeks. My sister actually gasped when she saw the jewelry box I'd had custom engraved. Even my usually stoic uncle smiled at the vintage bourbon I'd tracked down from his birth year. For 10 minutes, I was the center of attention in a way I hadn't been since childhood. They thanked me, hugged me, marveled at how I'd remembered their interests and preferences. Several people mentioned they couldn't believe how much thought I'd put into everything. Then I held out my hands. "Actually," I said, keeping my voice conversational, "I'm going to need those back." The room went quiet except for the Christmas music still playing from someone's phone. My sister looked down at the jewelry box in her lap, like she'd forgotten it was there. "What do you mean?" Mom asked, though I could see in her eyes that she already knew. "I mean, I'd like my gifts back. All of them." I started with my nephew, gently taking the gaming equipment from his hands. He was only 12, and the confusion on his face almost broke my resolve. But I kept going. One by one, I collected everything. The watch, the skincare products, the bourbon, the handbags. They handed them over without protest, though several people started to speak and then stopped. What could they say? That I was being unreasonable? That family doesn't work this way? When I had everything back in the bag, I looked around the room one more time. These people had raised me, shared holidays with me, been there for my graduation, and celebrated my achievements. They weren't evil. They weren't even particularly cruel. They were just thoughtless. And somehow that felt worse than malice. "You're right," I repeated, shouldering the bag. "I don't belong here." The silence followed me to the front door. No one called my name or asked me to wait. No one suggested we could talk this through or that maybe there'd been a misunderstanding about the reunion. They just watched me leave, probably already planning how they'd explain this to whoever asked about it later. I sat in my car for a long time before starting the engine. Through the window, I could see them beginning to move around again, conversations resuming in hushed tones. Life going on without me, just like it had the weekend before at a family reunion I'd never been invited to. But as I finally drove away, I realized I wasn't just taking the presents with me. I was taking something else entirely. The last of my willingness to keep trying to fit into spaces where I clearly wasn't wanted. Update 1. 3 days passed before anyone reached out. It was Mom, texting to ask if I was okay and suggesting we should talk. I read the message twice and then deleted it without responding. The thing about epiphanies is they change more than just your perspective, they change your priorities. For 31 years, I'd been chasing their approval, their inclusion, their acknowledgement that I mattered. I'd moved back to this state after college specifically to be closer to them. I'd organized my vacation days around their schedules, bought a house 20 minutes from where I grew up, and convinced myself that proximity would eventually equal closeness. But proximity isn't the same as belonging. And belonging isn't something you can earn by being convenient. I spent that weekend doing something I hadn't done in years. I made plans that had nothing to do with my family. I called my college roommate who'd moved to Portland and accepted his standing invitation to visit. I researched hiking trails I'd never explored, restaurants I'd never tried, activities I'd put off because family obligations always seemed to take precedence. On Monday, Dad called. I let it go to voicemail, then listened to his halting message about how they'd all talked and realized they'd handled things poorly. He wanted to meet for coffee to clear the air. I didn't call back. Tuesday brought a text from my sister with a paragraph about how she'd never realized I felt left out, followed by an invitation to dinner at her house that weekend. She mentioned she'd make my favorite dessert, as if chocolate cake could undo decades of casual exclusion. I didn't respond to that either. By Thursday, the messages were coming from everyone. Cousins I hadn't heard from in months suddenly wanted to catch up. My uncle sent a Facebook message about a fishing trip he was planning. Even my grandmother, who barely knew how to use her phone, managed to send a voice message saying she missed me. The attention was intoxicating and infuriating in equal measure. Where had all this concern been the week before? The month before? The year before? Why did it take a dramatic exit to make them realize I existed? Update 2. 2 weeks after the party, I got a call from my boss about a position that had opened up in the Seattle office. It was a promotion I'd been hoping for, with a significant salary increase and the chance to lead my own team. The catch was that I'd need to relocate within 6 weeks. 6 months earlier, I would have agonized over the decision. I would have weighed the impact on family relationships, considered how often I'd be able to visit, worried about missing important events. I might have even turned it down. Instead, I accepted on the spot. The moving process became my excuse for continued radio silence. Every time someone called, I told myself I was too busy packing, too stressed about the logistics, too focused on preparing for the new role. All of which was true, but it was also easier than facing the conversations I knew were coming. The ones where they'd try to convince me that what happened at the party was just a misunderstanding, that family is family, that we should all just move past it. My sister showed up at my house 3 days before the moving truck was scheduled to arrive. I was in the garage, sorting through boxes of college textbooks and old photo albums, when I heard her car in the driveway. She stood in the doorway looking smaller than usual, her confidence replaced by something that might have been genuine remorse. She asked why I was really leaving, whether it was just about the job or if it had to do with what happened at the party. She said she'd been thinking about all the times growing up when I'd been left out of things, and she was starting to realize it had been a pattern rather than isolated incidents. I kept sorting books while she talked. Science fiction novels I'd read in high school, philosophy texts from college courses I'd forgotten taking, programming manuals from my first job. A whole life's worth of interests and experiences that my family knew almost nothing about because they'd never thought to ask. When she finished talking, I told her about the job in Seattle. I explained that it was a good opportunity, that I was ready for a change, that sometimes people just need to start over somewhere new. What I didn't tell her was that I'd been looking at apartments in neighborhoods I'd researched specifically because they were near hiking trails and coffee shops and bookstores, places where I could build a life based on my own interests rather than family obligations. I didn't mention that I'd already found a climbing gym and signed up for a photography class, or that I was excited about the possibility of making friends who knew nothing about my family dynamics. She hugged me goodbye at the door, and I could tell she wanted to say something else. But some conversations happened too late to matter. Update 3. Seattle turned out to be exactly what I didn't know I needed. The job was challenging in the best way, requiring skills I'd been developing but never had the chance to fully use. My team was small but brilliant, and for the first time in my career, I felt like my ideas were not just heard but actively sought out. I found an apartment in Capitol Hill with enormous windows and a view of the Sound. On weekends, I explored neighborhoods with names like Fremont and Wallingford, discovering used bookstores and farmers markets and tiny restaurants that served food I'd never tried. I bought my first real piece of art, a photograph of the Olympic Mountains that I hung above my couch without asking anyone's opinion about the placement. The family calls continued for the first month, then gradually tapered off to weekly check-ins, then occasional texts. I responded to the important ones, when my grandmother had her surgery, when my cousin announced her engagement, but I stopped feeling obligated to participate in every casual conversation about weekend plans and work drama. It was my coworker Jessica who first pointed out how different I seemed from the person she'd met during my interview. More relaxed, she said. More present. Like I'd stopped waiting for permission to take up space. She was right, though I hadn't realized it until she said it out loud. 3 months into my new life, I got a call from Mom about Thanksgiving plans. The family was thinking about doing something different this year, she said. Maybe renting a cabin somewhere, making it a real vacation for everyone. She wanted to know if I'd be able to fly back for it, and whether I had any thoughts about locations. The old me would have been thrilled to be consulted. The old me would have spent hours researching cabins and coordinating schedules and trying to find options that would work for everyone's budget and preferences. Instead, I told her I already had plans. Which was true. I'd signed up to volunteer at a food kitchen on Thanksgiving, something I'd always wanted to do but never had time for when family obligations took precedence. I was also going to a Friendsgiving dinner that evening with people from work and their friends, the kind of chosen family gathering I'd heard about but never experienced. She sounded surprised, maybe a little hurt, but she didn't push. After we hung up, I realized it was the first holiday conversation we'd had where I hadn't felt anxious about disappointing someone. Update 4. The final piece of understanding came 6 months after I'd moved, in a conversation I had with my new neighbor. Marcus was in his 50s, recently divorced, and in the process of rebuilding relationships with his adult children. We'd started talking over beers on my balcony, sharing stories about family complications and fresh starts. He asked me why I'd really moved to Seattle, and I found myself telling him the whole story: the party, the reunion I'd missed, the gifts, the realization that I'd been trying to earn a place that was never really available to me. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said something that shifted everything into focus. Sounds like you weren't excluded. You were just never really included to begin with. There's a difference. He was right. The reunion wasn't an anomaly. It was the clearest example of a dynamic that had been in place for years. I hadn't been deliberately shut out of things. I'd simply never been automatically included. And there's a world of difference between those two experiences. My family loved me, I realized, but they loved me as an afterthought. They cared about me when they remembered to care, included me when it occurred to them to include me, considered my feelings when prompted to consider them. I wasn't unwanted, but I wasn't necessary either. And that realization was strangely liberating. Final update. It's been over a year now since the holiday party. I've built a life in Seattle that feels authentically mine in a way nothing ever had before. I have friends who text me about hiking plans and dinner reservations, coworkers who invite me to their kids' birthday parties, neighbors who know my coffee order and ask about my weekend projects. My family and I talk occasionally. The conversations are pleasant but surface level, the way you might talk to a distant relative you're fond of but don't really know anymore. They've stopped trying to convince me to move back, and I've stopped feeling guilty about not wanting to. Last month, I got a wedding invitation in the mail, my cousin's daughter getting married next spring. It was addressed to me personally, with a handwritten note about how much it would mean if I could be there. I RSVP'd yes and booked a flight, because some obligations are still worth honoring. But I also made sure to book a return flight the day after the wedding, because I've learned the difference between showing up for important moments and being available for every casual gathering that follows. The gifts from that holiday party are still in my closet, in the same bag I carried them out in. Sometimes I think about donating them, but somehow it feels important to keep them. Not as a reminder of that night, but as a reminder of the person I used to be. Someone who thought love could be purchased with the right gesture, that belonging could be earned through perfect thoughtfulness. I know now that real belonging doesn't require proof. The people who want you in their lives make space for you automatically. They think of you when making plans, consider your preferences when choosing restaurants, send you photos from family gatherings even when you can't attend. They don't make you beg for inclusion, and they don't make you prove your worth with expensive gestures. The revenge I thought I was taking that night, walking away with those gifts, turned out to be something else entirely. It was the first step toward building a life where I didn't need revenge, because I wasn't constantly being hurt by people whose love came with conditions I could never quite meet. And that, I've discovered, is worth more than any gift I could have given them.